Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of lecture 2. Remember our hand simulation example. We have blanks arriving to a drilling center. They're processed by the drill press. They exit once processing is complete, and blanks are processed first in, first out. We have the data down here. Okay. The terminology for the example, remember, we have entities. These are blank parts or blanks. We have resources. Our server is a server. That's a drill press. Our events are arrivals and departures. So the blank part arrives, that's one event. The drill press is finishing processing that blank part, that's our other event. We have that score sheet or our snapshot sheet, and we're going to start filling that out for a few of these. Okay, we're going to there actually would be, over the time length, if we set our time horizon to 20, there would actually be 12 snapshots. We're not going to do all of them. We're going to do some of them. I'm going to, at the end of this part, you're going to go out and do a couple on your own, and then I'm going to pick up and do one more, and then we'll see what the final snapshot would be at the end of time 20. So the first snapshot is for a clock time of 0. This is the initialization. And we immediately can fill in the event calendar for what happens next. That would be the next arrival. There's no departure because we're initializing. There's nothing in system right now. So we can take this arrival time, and that's what we fill in down here, and we don't need a departure time. There's nothing completed right now. Our system is empty, so of course nothing is, there's no parts completed. And there's no entity in service, and there's no queue, so we skip instead over here to filling out the system statistics. There is 0, the system state is 0 for B of t, right? Because there's nothing being served right now. So the drill press is empty. Similarly, there's no entity in system, so Q of t is also 0. So we just put a point there. Okay, and now we think about what happens next. For our next snapshot, we think about our next arrival time. So basically the idea here is that when is the next time point that we have to worry about? Is actually going to be 1.73. If you recall your mathematical understandings, there's an infinite number of time points in between 0 and 1.73. So it would be very impossible to consider every single time point. We don't have infinitely many times to, we don't have an infinite amount of time to consider that. So instead, we're just going to look at our next discrete time point of 1.73. Okay, so now we finish snapshot 1 and we're moving on to snapshot 2. Everything circled in purple is what we're going to have to update. And you can see that the way we're updating it is, and if you were doing this by hand, you might have the snapshot 1 at hand to help you fill in snapshot 2. And that's sort of how you want to think about it. We should be able to use the previous snapshot to complete the current snapshot. Okay, so the previous snapshot had all this information, and we're going to just update it. You can see it's all there. The first thing is the clock time, circled in pink now. And of course, the next clock time, as I mentioned before, that we have to consider is 1.73. So that'll be changed. Okay. Note that I'm not going to change this event calendar, this 1.73 in the event calendar. I'm not going to change this until I'm ready to, until I've used that information completely. Okay, the next thing, so that clock time is now finished. The next thing we'll change is the number completed. Well, there's 0 completed. I mean, this 1.73 is an arrival. It's not a departure. So there's nothing completed, so that stays 0. Then the entity in service, well, with an arrival, because of our assumptions, there's no delay. So the entity is, in fact, going to go into service at this point. And what is this entity in service? It'll be blank number 1. This is the first. We're going to label our entities in terms of the order of their arrival. So we'll label this number 1, and its remaining time, service time, is from here. So we put that in because it needs to be served completely. So it needs 2.9 for its remaining service time. Okay, and we're done now with the entity in service field. We think about our queue. because there was nobody in the system when the entity 1 arrived, the queue actually remains empty. So we just leave that blank. Now B of t, now this is now going to change. So what's going to happen here is, if you think about it, up until this 1.73, actually, I guess that's a bit, I went a little too far. Up until then, it was 0, but now at this 1.73 bit, it's going to jump up to 1. Okay, so this is 1.73. And now that jumps up to 1, because now the server is busy, right? The entity arrived, the part arrived, the drill press now has to start drilling. Q of t is the same way, right? So Q of t, if we get to that, again, at that same time point of 1.73, this is going to have to go up to 1. And we see that's what happens. Okay. Because at 1.73, just like up here at 1.73, suddenly we had an arrival, so now we have one part in system. Okay, so now we go back, and we have to update now the next arrival and the next departure times. So we'll do the next departure first. And there, the next departure time, that's going to occur in 2.9 time units, okay? So that's what we put there. Now the next arrival, we've been having 1.73 sitting there to help us with our calculations, but in fact, we have to think about the fact that that 1.73 has now been used, and we have to update that as well. So that's going to go to 1.35, right? Because the next arrival is 1.35. And that really completes snapshot 2. Okay, so snapshot 2 is now done. Okay, so we have to think about snapshot 3, and we think about that in terms of what happens next. And well, what happens next is either an arrival or a departure. We look at the minimum of those two times, 1.35 and 2.90, and we see the minimum is 1.35. And so that the next thing that occurs is then an arrival. It's going to be blank number 2. Okay, so blank number 2 is going to arrive, and we have to, for snapshot 3, right, we're on 3 now, we have to update all these fields again, everything that's circled. First, we'll start with the clock time. The clock time of 1.73, well, that was for snapshot 2. Now the next discrete event occurs because of an arrival 1.35 time units later. So we just add 1.35 to 1.73, and we get 3.08 for snapshot 3. Okay. Now, if I think about the number completed, well, what happened? Well, we had an arrival, and that arrival means that we still have 0 completed. Okay, the entity in service, well, that's still blank number 1. Okay, so now we have to update this, but this remaining service time has to be updated, right? The remaining service time is no longer 2.90. It's reduced by the amount of time it's been in service, which is 1.35, right? So that 2.90, we have to subtract from it the 1.35. Let's just make sure I put a real subtraction line in there. And that turns it into 1.55. All right, now we think about the queue. We have an arrival, right? We have an arrival, and when blank number 2 arrives, it finds that entity number 1 is already in service, so it has to wait. So we put in its queue and its arrival time. So it's entity 2. Its arrival time is 3.08, because that's the event that is occurring right now, is it's arriving. And we get its service time, and we put that in. That's a 1.76. Okay. Now we have to think about, so now the queue is complete, and we have to think about our B of t. Of course, we're still working on blank number 1, so we're still busy. But so we just draw that line across to represent this time point at 3.08, that we're still busy at this time, at this discrete event. We think about the Q of t, that's the number in system. Well, now that at this time point, at this 3.08, it shouldn't be surprising to you that this is going to jump up, right? Because now we have two entities in system, two parts in system, blank number one in service, and then we also have the queue now. So we have to reflect that. Okay. Now we go back to our events calendar and we think, well, we have to now update the departure time. The departure time, remember, has been reduced. So this has to come over here and populate it. No longer do we need 2.9 time units. We now need 1.55 time units. Finally, we have to think about our arrival times. Now this arrival time, the next thing that occurs for arrivals is not 1.35. That just happened. Now we have to think about the part number 3, blank number 3 arriving. And so we have to update that so that it's 0.71. Okay, and that concludes snapshot 3. Okay, that's what it should look like now. All right, now we're not going to break out into groups, right? We're not doing that. Instead, you do the next two snapshots and start part 3. And so do that before you do part 3. Okay. And I'll see you back here for that.